Hey everyone, this is Jared Wright, your instructor for Sociology 100 online. This is our week 3 review video, and I'm just going to start off here talking about chapter 5 about groups and social networks. So, just to jump right into it, um, the chapter begins talking about a very important sociologist named George Zimmel from the 1950s and some of his ideas. Um, so George Zimmel spent a lot of time studying groups, and in sociology, we talk about how important groups are, and we really focus on, as I've mentioned in previous weeks, understanding people um, in context of social interaction and in groups. Even society itself is just one big group. So understanding the basic dynamics of groups and the different types of groups that exist are very important. And there are many ways that we can understand groups sort of theoretically and structurally outside of specific contexts, um, or without having to consider sort of the quality of the specific people involved or the relationships involved. We can think about it almost in sort of a general mathematical kind of sense. And that's really what Zimmel did. He started off looking at the most basic form of a group of all, which he calls a dyad, which is basically just two people. You need at least two people to be in a group. Uh, and he found that by comparing dyads with what he calls triads, which would be a group of three people, that there were some very specific and distinct differences in the dynamics between these two groups. So with a dyad, you have a direct one-on-one relationship between two people. And, excuse me, this can involve a romantic relationship. It could be a friendship. It could be like a practical relationship, like two roommates or something. Um, but the nature of the relationship being that there's only two people, it's very direct. It's a close relationship, perhaps even an intimate one. It involves a certain amount of trust and mutual dependence because both people have to fully participate in the relationship and be a part of it. Because if any one person leaves, then suddenly the whole thing breaks down. It ceases to be a group altogether. Now, this becomes very different when you have a triad. Suddenly, when a third person is introduced, the dynamic changes because now you have not just two people directly connected to one another, you have three people where each person is connected to two other people. And those connections can now, it introduces the possibility of those connections being either weak or strong. You can have two of the people in the triad very strongly connected to each other, and then the third person not so much, perhaps being kind of a third wheel, if you've heard that expression before. You know, for example, if you've ever hung out as a single person, if you've ever hung out with like a couple, a romantic couple, you can sometimes get that feeling of being a third wheel, like it's kind of awkward, out of place, like they're way closer together than you are to them, or perhaps you're close with one of them but not the other one of them. So there's all kinds of different dynamics that can come up in a three-person relationship or a three-person group that's different from the dyad. And Zimmel gives three specific examples in the textbook here, which is the role of the mediator, in which the third person is sort of a buffer between two other people that may be in conflict or in disagreement with one another, or that don't get along well. So the third person is kind of the glue holding them together. Um, the second is the tertius gaudens, which is kind of the opposite of that, in which the third person is more kind of playing the other two against each other for their own personal benefit in some way. And then the third is the divide et impera, which gotta love these Latin names, means divide and conquer, and that's when you have the third person specifically trying to break up the other two and drive a wedge between them. So these are three specific types of dynamics of a triad, and there could potentially be many more. You could have a triad in which all three people get along with each other perfectly well. Um, But most often we find actually when we look at triads that there tends to be one person that is a little bit less connected than the other two are. There tends to be that kind of third wheel situation. So you oftentimes end up with these interesting kind of um, dynamics or competition or jealousies or things like that. And this is just a good example in the most basic sense of how, you know, as groups increase in size, as you add even just a single person, the dynamics of the group become immensely more complex the bigger and bigger and bigger they get. You know, when you have a group of only two people, there's only one possible connection, and so that connection has to be pretty strong. When you have a group of four people, there's six potential connections there between all four people. And so that raises all kinds of new possibilities. You could have person A and person C that are not even connected to one another, but are connected to the other three people in the group, you know? Or if you have a group of six people, suddenly that's 15 potential connections. And there's all kinds of different new dynamics and more complexities that can result from that. And as sociologists, you know, this is something we spend a lot of time with, understanding the dynamics of groups, of specific groups usually, but we apply these different ideas and theories to help us understand groups in real context when we study them. So Zimmel also had three types of groups that he defined, of just general sorts of groups, which is the small group, the party, and the large group. These are not defined by specific numbers. These are just terms that are sort of relative to one another, like small and large. But the small group basically is, you know, just a few people in which uh, they're all engaged in face-to-face interaction. They're all in the same place. Everyone kind of knows each other. There's typically a single point of focus for the group, so everybody's doing the same thing. Everybody is working on the same thing. There's perhaps only one conversation happening at a time. These are also like informal groups, so there's no structure. And because there's no structure, everyone basically has the same status. No one is specifically better than anyone else in any way in terms of like formal structure. You're just people that are informally gathered, um, focusing on whatever task or object of interest. Um, and as the group grows, it can become a party, which is a little bit larger. And a party, basically, the main difference is that a party um, has multiple points of focus. So you have many different conversations going on at the same time, which tends to happen naturally when you have a lot of people. It also tends to be, you know, informal and unstructured in the same sense of the small group. And then the large group is specifically a type of group that has a formal structure to it. So this would be a formal authority structure, such as, you know, like in a workplace where you have a boss and you have managers and you have employees and so on and so forth. And the very nature of having this kind of formal structure means that you have status inequality, because you have statuses now, and that naturally results in inequality in the distribution of power, because the people that are leaders, the people that are at the top, are going to have more power than people that are at the bottom of the structure. And that's inherent in any group when it becomes formally structured, that you have power dynamics and power relations of that sort. So there's also the next thing they talk about is another social theorist named Charles Cooley. And Cooley, you may remember from the last chapter, he's the one who talked about the idea of the looking glass self. Cooley also studied groups, and he had two types of groups that he defined were the primary group and the secondary group. And this is just a different way of understanding different types of group characteristics. He defined the primary group as being the group that is most important to you, basically would be your family. And this is defined as having members that cannot be changed out. So like in your family, you only have one father, one sister. You know, you can't just go and replace them with someone else. And these are long-lasting. It's an enduring group, that sort of sticks around. Um, and he also mentions it tends to be your primary agent of socialization, your family. A secondary group, on the other hand, is an impersonal group. This can be something more like people that work together, or like a soccer team, for example. Um, Everyone is participating in a part of this group, but the members in this group are interchangeable. The role is more important than the individual. So on a soccer team, for example, if your goalie gets injured, you can replace him with another goalie. The important thing is that you have a goalie, and not so much on the specific individual. Um, and these also tend to be more um, instrumental groups. They're functional for a specific interest or for a specific goal that they're trying to fulfill. Um, and they're more, the affiliation in the group is what they call contingent, which means it depends on certain factors, which means you can leave the group if something happens, like if you quit your job or you get injured or something like that. Um, The book also has an interesting little section on group conformity, in which they talk about the Solomon-Asch experiment, which was originally done back in the 40s. And Solomon-Asch was a really brilliant experiment that he did, which is still very well known and popular in sociology. We don't do a lot of direct experiments, but this is really one that has worked out well and has been replicated many times, and people always come up with very, very similar results. So it's believed to be, very reliable in that sense. And basically what he did is he had two sets of lines. He had one line drawn over here, and then he had three lines drawn over here of different length. And he just sat people down in a room and he said, match which one of these three lines matches the length of this other line. And the key of the experiment is that he would have people sitting in a row, and he would have the first several people in that row, he secretly told all of them to give the same wrong answer. And so the real experiment was to see what the last person would say for their answer. And he found that about 33%, or about 1/3 of all the people tested, would give the wrong answer, the same wrong answer that the group gave. In other words, they would give in to group pressure and conform against their better judgment. Even seeing clearly what the right answer is, they would still give the wrong answer because everyone else in the group did. And it just goes to show the power that groups have over us, and the power of conformity in this controlled laboratory setting, of course. But that can be applied to the real world and to social life in a number of different ways. Um, and there's other variables that can be added as well. I think females had a slightly higher conformity rate than males did. I think there were certain age groups as well that showed higher rates of conformity than others. I think adolescents, teenagers tend to have higher rates of conformity than adults. So there's lots of different, like, sort of variables you can add and test in this regard to compare. Speaking of which, the book also mentions reference groups, which is basically just a group you would use as a comparison to another group. So in the cases I was just using, if you were looking at men, then women could be your reference group. If you're looking at teenagers, then adults could be your reference group, or children could be your reference group, just depending on the kind of comparison you're interested in making. Um, and the book also refers to in-groups and out-groups, and basically just an in-group tends to be the most hegemonic kind of group in society, whereas the out-group tends to be more of a minority group. Another way of thinking about this too is relative to an individual. An in-group can simply be used to reference the group that they are a part of, whereas the out-group can just be any other group that you're not a part of. Excuse me again, geez. So those are just a brief review of chapter 5 there, of the first part of it. I'm running out of video time, so I'm going to stop here, and part 2 I'll talk about networks.